Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Again, please do not hesitate to, you can raise your hand or you can just yell out. These talks, again, I'll say a little about the talk series. This is the next in our Treats talk series. I was going to make a joke and say, I'm very proud to introduce as the director of the Bioethics and Participant Advocacy Program or Subject Advocacy Program. We don't always know. The Bioethics program of the Indiana CTSI. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, a good friend of mine, one of the smartest people, not to mention nicest and good looking who you'll ever meet, Peter Schwartz. I usually have the pleasure of introducing the speakers for this series, and I'm happy to be doing the talk today. It's a topic which I'll say more about our interest in this at the Center for Bioethics and in the Bioethics program of the CTSI, but it's an important topic. And I'm going to actually say a little here. It's like a buzzword. I will say that if you hang around in the research world or translational research areas, you'll hear about learning healthcare systems. And I won't try to educate us or anybody about, what exactly it means, but I do want to address some of the ethics issues that arise around it. And again, our goal in Treats talks are to present a 30 to 45-minute introduction to a key topic in research ethics for translational research, especially something which is going on right now. So this seems to qualify. And again, our intended audience are researchers, members of research teams, students, trainees, public members, to give them an orientation to the issues. This can never be the last word, but we mean it to be a good introduction. We hope it is. The videos are archived with additional resources at this link, basically the bioethics page. This is the IU Center for Bioethics page. I'm going to go ahead and go there. This should be on your screen. Can you see it? It's the Treats talks. There are 34 Treats talks archived here. You can see them A to Z. The way they're done sort of by default is a reverse chronological order in order of the most recent first. And you can choose here and hit the core, and you can get a core listing of research ethics topics. And we mean this to be a real resource for the community and beyond to get information about research ethics. Now, if you, I mentioned it's searchable also. Now, if you have a question related to something that we've done a Treats talk on, watch the Treats talk if you'd like. Again, but don't even wait. Feel free to call us, the BSAP program. We do consultations for researchers. There's a link there for the overview of our program. Again, it's through the Indiana Center for Bioethics website. It's also the website for the CTSI Bioethics program, and there's a link there, or you can just email me or the program manager. Okay. So as in this group, we all know that research ethics is related to clinical ethics. Many of the same principles apply, some of the same topics, but things are a bit different, right? Because the Belmont report famously distinguished between the ethics of research and the ethics of clinical care. Perhaps most importantly, that the goal of the activity is different, right? When you're a patient, and when you're a research participant, those are two different roles. You may play both roles at the same moment. If you're a patient, also participating in research, but there's two different things to be doing. When you're a patient or a healthcare customer, I guess they call it, or a consumer, you're there to get your health treated, to either treat a disease or to prevent disease, perhaps for your own good. When you're a research participant, you are playing a different role. You are helping advance research and the understanding of science, perhaps the care of future patients like you. It's actually not self-directed. It is actually an altruistic activity. There may be some selfish, in the good way, some payoffs for you. Maybe it's a treatment that you cannot access unless you participate in the research project. But the idea is the main reason you're there is to actually help others. So when you're signed up for research, first of all, you should be very clearly told that there's a difference in what's going on now. It's for research, not for your healthcare. And secondly, we want to follow the principles of consent, right? So it should be voluntary. It should be informed consent, knowing what they're signing up for. Your care should be focused on protecting you. Even though the goal of the activity is advancing science and medicine, of course, you deserve beneficence from your researcher, from the doctor, perhaps, who is carrying out the research, in that your risks should be minimized and the benefits to you and the benefits to science should be maximized. And the justice issues, of course, apply as well. So now, this traditional model, this famous split between research and clinical care, which has been the cornerstone of research ethics, has been questioned or challenged. The first one is maybe the most obvious for all of us living in and working in a advanced modern healthcare system, which is that electronic health record informatics means data is collected and can be used in research, in a powerful way, even though it's an observational type of research. Obviously, you could do chart review in the old days, but it's a whole new level once you've got electronic medical records. And now we have machine learning. So even without the human mind doing this, we have the ability to augment the human observational abilities to actually learn things from the medical record. Now, this is the second part of learning healthcare systems. We know there's a long path from research through to actually affecting care. I made up some steps here, right? Research, analysis, publication, review, eventual implementation. People who are pushing for breaking down barriers are saying, look, let's move faster, right? We do the research, we get the analysis, we immediately get it back into the clinic to then see better about how we can best help patients, how we can best advance medical science. And so they would point to that, to speeding up the process, get the data into the research faster, get the results from the research back into clinical. I like to see, you can do that, into the clinical care faster. And of course, we have a model of this, right? The quality improvement studies take place without any review by the IRB. There is no informed consent necessary from the participants. And so some people look at quality improvement. In fact, there's a great talk Marriott gave a couple of years ago where she raised this about quality improvement versus research, how to know when you're doing one or the other. And she raised the issue of learning healthcare systems then, which is once you say, well, there's a type of basically research, it's you try to find out what works, you're doing it on a local basis, which makes it quality improvement rather than something which is generalizable for the world. So so you call it quality improvement. But in that case, there's some of these barriers or these hurdles have been removed. So what could we do to change the model? And once we change the model, what does research ethics look like? Now, again, part of my, I would call it delay on giving this talk I give in classes related to what I'm going to say to you guys today. But part of my delay on this, treats talks are supposed to be applied for researchers now. And admittedly, some of the things I'm going to be talking about are more a model which is coming into being in the near future, I would say, or is being developed now, may progress. If you're a researcher doing clinical trials right now, maybe you'd say this issue of learning healthcare systems is not really relevant because it's not here yet. It's more like the future. We make a joke in medicine sometimes that this is the future and it always will be. Perhaps learning healthcare systems will never actually happen. But I would say, given the volume of work and the degree to which it is referred to and discussed, I think we should know about it. I think it's worthwhile for a treats talk, which is why I went ahead and did this one. So what's the idea of learning healthcare systems? I'll be talking a lot today about a paper by Ruth Faden and Tom Beecham, which is listed here from Hastings Center Report, one of the big ethics journals from 2013. The idea is that it rejects the assumption that research and clinical practice are, from an ethics standpoint, or really a practical standpoint, fundamentally different enterprises, right? It's dissolving that line, again, that cornerstone issue in research ethics. Here's a longer way of saying it. This is from a paper by Peter Emby and some colleagues. Peter Emby, our previous director at the CEO of our Regan Street Center here. As they said in their article from JAMA, the goal is weaving continuous and systematic evidence-generating medicine activities into routine practice. This model creates a continuous cycle, right, of systematic care improvement that couples evidence generation with evidence application to healthcare that embodies and enables the goals of the learning healthcare system. The idea that as we do medicine, we learn from it and we then change medicine in a very tight circle. So that's two ways to talk about it. And I'll talk more about the different aspects of learning healthcare systems as I go forward. And I'm sorry if I'm speaking fast. You can always watch this on recording if you're watching it at half speed, but I like to create the 1.5 speed experience in my actual personal interactions. So the two key changes is when Faden and Beecham presented this very important, I would call it seminal statement of how to think about the ethics of learning healthcare systems. I'm actually going to walk through their presentation to give you guys a taste, I think, of the key ethical issues. You could choose other presentations, but I think this is a good one. They focus on these aspects of the ethics. First of all, two obligations that are rarely discussed in research ethics previously. The obligation of healthcare institutions, health professionals, and patients to contribute to learning in healthcare. That is a different model, right? We've always said that participating in research is a voluntary issue. They call it a kind of obligation, and they want to figure out, can that be an ethical thing to require? Secondly, an obligation that the research enterprise addresses problems of unjust inequalities in healthcare. This paper is 2013. It's a little bit ahead of the latest, I would say, focus on these issues. But I think those who've been pushing for learning healthcare systems have realized that as we move into learning healthcare systems, we need to do better with inequality in healthcare. And that's a cornerstone for the learning healthcare system idea. You could say there are two parts to a just healthcare system, the system we are trying to instantiate and make progress with our work in learning healthcare systems. First of all, of course, providing high quality care, right? At a minimum, technically competent healthcare based on the strongest clinical evidence, delivered with high patient safety. And again, an aspect that's not always talked about in the research realm enough, which is aiming for economic well-being, a society in which current and future generations have the economic resources necessary to live a decent life over the course of the lifespan. We can't spend all our money on healthcare. We must, of course, achieve excellent healthcare. We also have to be good stewards of money, make sure we're actually also figuring out how to provide efficient and affordable healthcare. So the cornerstone of this talk will be these 7 obligations, which are the model, I would say, the leading model for the ethics of a learning healthcare system. Each one raises questions as well as providing a proposal for how to move forward in this system. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get through them. Some of them are old things. They look like the Belmont report in terms of what they expect of participants and healthcare systems and researchers. Others are new and are ways to try to think about how you can ethically do research, how you can ethically move forward with a learning healthcare system, even though you've dissolved, after you have dissolved this sharp line between research and clinical care. So here are the 7 obligations. I won't read through them. I'm going to walk through them one at a time. Again, in the interest of time, I think this is going to be a little longer than your classic treats talk. I will be done by 1:40 though, probably 1:35. So we should have 25 minutes or at least 20 minutes to discuss further. Okay. First, obligation to respect patients. These are the cornerstone concepts of autonomy, informed consent that you see in traditional research ethics. The change is that they do want to raise the idea that while it's necessary, it's also important to be aware of the danger of undue deference or focusing just on this. So here's an example, or here's what they say. I think it's a lovely quote, very thought-provoking. Respecting autonomy is primarily about allowing persons to shape the basic course of their lives in line with their values and independent of the control of others. That sounds right. But given that, not all healthcare decisions are likely to be attached to a significant autonomy interest of individual patients, right? Autonomy is the ability to make important decisions for yourself. So how often a lab test is performed, or who gives you the medicine, the pharmacist or the pharm tech, that is not maybe an area where your autonomy is the central principle. Because to be honest, making choices about those things, whether they draw blood 2 days in a row or 1 day, it's really, you could say, it's more about whether it's going to make a difference in your care, not about what you like, not about how you want to live your life. That's the suggestion here. Here's the other side of the coin. Similarly, there's an obligation to respect clinician judgment. Let me say a word about how they're saying this, right? Part of the reason why we separate research, I wonder if somebody's texting me about this talk. No. Why, you can always yell out if there's a technical problem or anything. One of the reasons why we separate research from clinical care is you should know when you're receiving clinical care that your provider is giving you the best care they can for you, focused on you, maybe within certain constraints of cost or a healthcare system, but they're focused on improving your care. If a clinician is participating in research, there's a danger, you might think, that their judgment is being interfered with. They're not being allowed to provide the kind of care they think is best for you. And so one of the number one dangers of having a learning healthcare system, a system which is not just focused on providing care, but in advancing learning healthcare, advancing learning. The danger, you could say, is that you're not respecting clinician judgment. You're saying you have to do this because you're in a study, rather than you have to do this as you decide for your patient. So judgment includes, if we're going to respect clinicians, evidence-based professional experience in light of the patient's values. That must be respected. Their caveat here, similar to their caveat for the patient autonomy, is it's not a violation of clinician judgment or of respecting it to impose some constraints on clinician behavior, such as something, I'm going to call it unimportant, something where their judgment doesn't matter, like how they enter their note in the computer. I'm going to get yelled at by the clinicians here. I too might yell as a clinician myself to say, how I write notes is up to me. But there is the danger, and I think we should recognize that some clinician behavior is based on custom or bias, right? So evaluating the strength of the obligation to respect clinician judgment usually entails a contextual assessment of the likely impact of any proposed restriction on the exercise of clinician judgment on patients' health or autonomy interests. For example, I like choosing a certain medicine for first-line hypertension. This month, again, if you watch this on recording, it won't be current anymore, but in 2023, I think it was a month or two ago, we had a study showing that basically how patients respond to medicines in different classes for hypertension. Again, my field of work, primary care, is very variable. So while I like hydrochlorothiazide and I use it as my first-line agent, chlorthalidone may be just as good. Lisinopril may be better for some of my patients. My preference for hydrochlorothiazide is a matter of bias and comfort personally, not a matter of providing the best possible care. So if you had a study that basically forced me or encouraged me to use different medicines for different patients as part of a learning healthcare system to see which one works best, you might say, yeah, that violates Peter's clinician judgment, but not in a way that is unethical. Peter's clinician judgment here, you're calling it judgment, is almost an exaggeration. It's more like practice or custom. And actually, if we're going to override custom, that might be acceptable in the goal of achieving those goals of a learning healthcare system. Or perhaps how I write notes. If you made it difficult for me to write it the way I like and made me do it a different way, although it's painful for me to even imagine that, perhaps that would be just a matter of making me do something in a new way rather than making me fail to take care of my patients with my best abilities. Okay. Providing optimal care to each patient is certainly an obligation. Certainly, as we move into a learning healthcare system, optimal care must be provided. And secondly, avoid imposing non-clinical risks and burdens. Getting healthcare is hard enough. If you're going to also involve people in a process which is collecting data for learning, if that imposes additional risks and burdens, that has got to be acknowledged and has to be avoided. If you're trying to learn, you can't impose certainly extreme risks and burdens. So the optimal care to each patient, we want to make sure they're not getting any care that in any way could be expected to be lower than optimal. So just use the hypertension case again. If my patient had to get lisinopril instead of my choice hydrochlorothiazide, Peter's not happy, but you really can't claim the patient got non-optimal care because they're both frontline medicines for most of my patients starting hypertension treatment. So we're respecting optimal care, even though it might be different care. And that would be a key obligation to take advantage to be aware of. Obligation to avoid imposing non-clinical risks and burdens. So if there are needs to come to the healthcare center more often or to have some kind of risk, then yes, that's a case which is going to look like not a learning healthcare system case. If you're going to give somebody a new medicine, which has unknown risks, you're going to have substantial burdens as part of the research study. That's going to look more like traditional healthcare. where that's not going to be part of clinical care. It's going to be separated. If we can't limit the non-clinical risks and burdens to a minimal amount, then calling it healthcare and not acknowledging it's different and a type of research would be inappropriate. Again, they mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, the need to address unjust inequalities. This is a new one, right? The idea that actually there's an obligation, that if you're part of a healthcare system, you're a clinician, an investigator, a health institution, a payer, a purchaser, that you have an obligation to feed information into the system that increases knowledge. So that's the first obligation that maybe we haven't talked about. That, well, if you want to just be a provider, you're a provider. The idea here is you have at least some obligation to help medicine move forward. That is a core principle of learning healthcare systems. And the last obligation, the last of the 7 obligations is the obligation of patients to contribute to the common purpose of improving the quality and value, affordability of clinical care and the healthcare system. And that is potentially a sticking point. We may talk about it during the discussion if you'd like. The idea is that everybody receiving care, every person here, every person worldwide has an interest in the healthcare system being able to provide quality healthcare and to do that in an equitable way and for an affordable price. And so if you're there just to receive care, yes, of course, but within those constraints imposed by those first 5 or 6 obligations, that you're going to get optimal care, your provider's judgment will not be unfairly interfered with, you will be respected as a person within those obligations being respected. Burdens and risks will be minimized or avoided. Within the setting where those things are respected, you have an obligation to contribute, to accept perhaps minimal amounts of treatment, to minimal amounts of burden or risk to contribute to learning. And you can make philosophical arguments. I won't bore people on this call. I'm happy to have this conversation with anybody. The Humean idea of reciprocal obligation, the Rawlsian idea of what you would decide in a veil of ignorance situation in the original position, or utilitarian perspective, which could be, you could call it a public health perspective. There's really a lot of things you could say. But within, again, those constraints of how we're thinking about a learning healthcare system, it's not just nice of you to participate, it's actually an obligation of sorts. Certainly as the burdens become higher, the obligation may be eliminated. So if it's just participating in a registry, allowing review of your de-identified health information, perhaps being interviewed in a non-difficult way, those would be cases where, again, Vaden and Beecham and their team want to argue you have an obligation to contribute. Randomized trial of new device, you have no obligation to participate in that. The risks and burdens are high. It's not optimal care since it's a research setting. In that case, your obligation is minimal or absent. You should be told when things are going on. That's a duty of transparency. Seems reasonable, something to add there. Okay, so that's 30 minutes. I could stop there and we could just talk about this framework and this question. I would, if you will tolerate it, I'd like to go on for about 5 more minutes to a case or a set of cases. It's from a New England Journal article from around the same time period in the 20-teens that actually gave some examples of how you might mess around, change the ideas of consent and research in the setting of comparative effectiveness research. So a case where we're comparing 2 or more treatments or interventions that are both approved, but that need to be compared to be understood more clearly in their impact. So why don't I do this, and then we'll, as I said, we'll have at least 25 minutes, I think, between 25 and 20 minutes to discuss. Do I have, I guess, silence and cameras off is assent. If you want to give me the like, no, we're not doing that. I've got things I've got to say now. I'd be happy to pause now, but anyway, does anybody want me to pause now? I'll stop for a second. In the absence of any further comments, let's go into this. This is also lead author on this is also Ruth Faden from Georgetown. And this is an article in the New England Journal arguing that in some randomized comparative effectiveness trials, again, where both interventions are approved, but we're comparing them, perhaps in those settings, you could have a streamlined consent process or actually no consent at all. The 7 obligations that we listed would be satisfied in a way that would allow you to proceed without really a typical consent. Let me explain. Patients will be engaged. They have to be involved in overseeing the process. So they have to decide about how the system will decide what studies to do. They would need to look over the framework and agree that the 7 obligations are met. Patients and lay people would have to be part of this. The key thing is to look at the study. It's getting back to that obligation. I think it was number 4 about limiting obligations and limiting risks and burdens. So if a study has no or minimal effect on care, Faden and colleagues are saying there should be that study should be able to go forward with no notification that patients are in the study. We can satisfy the 7 obligations without actually having an informed consent. Community notification is fine. Next level up, where there's minor but meaningful effects, then patients should be notified. They should say there's part of the study going on. Your care is being partly directed due to the need to learn. And you can refuse to let us do this, perhaps an opt-out, but that's as much consent as is necessary. And the third group is that there are significant negative effects possible. And this is more like traditional comparative effectiveness research or our model for informed consent for clinical trials, where there's prospective, written, informed consent. So I'll give examples of each one, and then I'll stop and we can talk. I'm happy also to talk about these examples to hear what you think of them. So let me just put, I think it's 6 examples I have. Let me put them each in a category. So here's one, a study that compared the effectiveness of sending a medication reminder, you should be taking this medicine or you're due for a refill, by text versus email. We don't know which is better. We're only going to use patients who've approved, said, yes, you can contact me by text or email. But what's different is instead of choosing which one to use just randomly based on the person in the room, or maybe the doc likes using text or the pharmacy likes using email, whatever it is, we're going to actually randomize patients. So one group's going to get the notifications by text. One group's going to get them by email. It's part of a study, basically, to see which one works better. And patients won't even be told. They've been included in a study. It's a classic learning healthcare system, perhaps the least concerning one. And they can choose, they will be sent the notification one way or the other because of the study. But again, this is patients who have agreed to being contacted that way. Another example would be, maybe we want to know whether we should test patients once or twice during a hospitalization. For us clinicians who've worked in the hospital, we know that a lot of blood draws happen without clear evidence for doing them every day or every 2 days or every 5 days. And so maybe we'd like to study that. So some patients that are in the hospital, that be in a situation where some doctors would order the test every day, some doctors would do it, say, every other day or less often. And we're basically going to randomize patients to how often they get a laboratory test. We're not going to ask them to be consent to be part of that study. We don't know if the downsides of drawing blood every day exceed the benefits of just happening to have that in a situation where a lot of doctors would not feel necessary to do it. Obviously, it requires on the patient's selection. Perhaps that would be another case. The first one, randomly assigning patients with back pain to acupuncture or a home exercise regimen. Again, some physicians will choose one, some physicians will choose the other. Perhaps we don't know which is better. What if we randomize them? In this case, this is a type 2 example. There's a difference in the care being provided there. Some would argue in this case, you must opt out. I've done this with students. Some people want this one to be in type 1. No even opt out for it. Just like, well, they're both approved treatments. Nothing wrong with just randomizing patients to one or the other. The next one is the one I kind of was gesturing at throughout my presentation, where perhaps we're randomizing patients who are starting hypertension to start on the diuretic Peter always uses or the diuretic that Maria always uses. I mean, it's basically random already, whether you're seeing Peter or Maria. I happen to like one, she happens to like another one. But perhaps we want to do the study to find out which is better. There's no way to tell just by looking at our patients. Perhaps machine learning can figure it out. But there's a lot of different things in the way I practice medicine and the way Maria practices medicine. And the only way would be to randomize. In this case, you might say to patients, look, you're starting medicine. There is a trial which has chosen the specific medicine from the type that your doctor might use randomly. If you really don't want us to do it that way, we can take you out of the study. But otherwise, that's how it's going to happen. Now, type 3 examples would be the ones which are more like traditional informed consent, where it really looks like something completely separate from healthcare because it's research. So again, patients with back pain or scoliosis to go to surgery or bracing, that kind of trial would need traditional informed consent or chemotherapy trials. So you can't give somebody an untested drug which has not been approved without a traditional informed consent process. Okay, that's kind of where I wanted to stop. We have hit the 4:35 mark. I'm happy to talk about SPRINT and support, two trials that were relatively controversial. These are comparative effectiveness also. I think they would both go in the type 3 group where we have to do randomized controlled trials. I won't talk about them further right now, though. So open questions for learning healthcare system ethics and for being part of a learning healthcare system. How do patients feel about being randomized, for example, in these comparative effectiveness trials without being informed, or perhaps with just being given the opportunity to opt out? Again, even when the two interventions are equally evidence-based. We know that some of us like the ethical model, which would do this. How do patients feel about it? How would lay people feel about it? We have various projects we might be doing, hopefully in the upcoming years, which might help us get at this. So it's the next step towards a truly learning healthcare system. There's, of course, the danger that if we started doing things with less disclosure, that less consent, that would raise the danger of decreasing trust or increasing distrust. And of course, if you did start doing this, what would happen to our typical regulatory structure, which is governed by the common rule? Would the common rule have to be updated? Yes. How would it be updated? And how would the IRB have to modify its procedures? And that is where I'm going to stop. And in fact, I'm going to take down this beautiful slide, and I'll just show our faces and blank boxes, and people can ask questions. I'm happy to put the slides back up if anybody has any questions. Thanks. You can turn your camera on, or you can just ask. Oh, you can ask in chat. There's a chat. Oh, you kids today with your keep talking, Peter. Oh, that was Karen saying that I should keep going with the talk. Thank you, Karen. You usually tell me not to keep talking. No. Hello, conference room. Do you have a question? Oh, my conference room. I will. If you guys don't ask me questions, we can go back. Let me show you something. I'm going to threaten you. Let me show you. So what do you guys think about these? I mean, why don't we do it this way? I do this in my class. Do you agree that these would be cases where you would be comfortable not even telling the participants that they're part of a trial? Do you buy the 7 obligations, that we can satisfy the 7 obligations? What do you guys think? Do either of these bother you? Maybe we really should never do type 1. Maybe the least informed consent should be type 2, where at least we tell them they're part of a study and then tell them they can opt out. So maybe you feel that one of these should be type 2, where they are warned there's a study going on and they should opt out if they don't want to be part of the study. Or if you don't want to answer that question, which I'm posing to you, feel free to pose me a question. You have a question?
I don't have a question, but I was just going to say that I definitely feel the most comfortable with the situation number one here. Situation number one of type 1. Situation number 2, I feel less comfortable with. I guess the question
Gotcha.
is, yeah, I think the question is, will there ever be one that, you know, everyone feels completely comfortable with? Probably not. And there will always be, you know, there might be a patient that's negatively affected by getting an email versus a text. I mean, I know I would much more likely miss an email of a pharmacy reminder versus a text. It seems like a small thing, but you know, it certainly could create some problems for people. So it's tough to say whether that's fine or not.
Love it. That's a good comment, Pierce. Very reasonable concern. So right, people, again, whatever you do in healthcare, right? Send them by text, you could harm them. Send them by email, you could harm them. And so the idea of learning healthcare system is to accept and to recognize there could be harm. I'm going to guess the claim for the learning healthcare system people who would push that this is one where you do not need to even tell them is that the risk of harm is no higher if you randomly assign them to these two categories than if it's basically random already, because pharmacist A likes to use text and pharmacist B likes to use email. So you already can be harmed by the method that the pharmacist chooses. And in that setting, the harm is still possible. You've agreed to both ways of contacting you. It's basically random which one they're going to use, but we don't know which one's better. I love that you think, Pierce, that you think the text is better. You're one of these kids with your phones and your text, and you're like, I'd rather get a text. But we don't know that it's better. We won't know that until we do the trial. And so that's why the learning healthcare system would be like, Pierce, I agree. There is harm possible. Just like there's harm possible when whatever other choices are made in your care. But in this case, we're making the choice as part of a goal of learning. And that's acceptable. It's an acceptable harm. Just to let you know, I love that you asked the question, Pierce, because then, as usual with the question, you've helped the other people on this talk, people listening to this later, who would have had the same exact question. It's a great question, Pierce. And now Nick Oliver, the soon-to-be new program manager of the IU Center for Bioethics, has his hand up. Nick?
Hello, everyone. I had a question, actually, and it's essentially for the no notification of subject participation. How is that going to implement an ongoing goal to build trust between patients and providers?
Excellent. You think they're like rebel, huh?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Feel that without this transparency, without informing people that they're in the study and informing people on the decision-making process, that they're going to feel betrayed or used. At least from my perspective.
Yeah, it's a reasonable concern, right? The goal of pushing forward and doing this is the goal of learning and improving care. And we wouldn't do this now. Oh, maybe Karen's gonna tell me we could do this now. Could we get a waiver of informed consent for this study, Karen? I guess we could, right? If we wanted to do the first study.
It would definitely be exempt, Peter. I don't know. I was looking at I don't know if anybody from IRB is listening.
Yeah,
I don't think so, because assuming your bullet point 1, it is a procedure that would have happened regardless, right? So it's just a natural observation of what. So I certainly am not IRB to give the final determination, but I'm assuming that's what your example number 1 is. Number 2, that confuses me. So I would totally not following your that no notification of participant, because I would have to believe that if you're going to stick someone twice as much in in the second group, that is definitely a risk.
Right. So they're going to have to do informed consent. So here's the thing, Nick, the reason I asked, I started talking and then I realized I wasn't sure. And thank you, Karen. That's very, very helpful. So Nick, it's a great question. I think it's a key cornerstone question for this, right? The idea of pushing hard to do a learning healthcare system, which is streamlining or reducing informed consent, is because we can learn more quickly, more cheaply, right? And actually take care of people better. And so the most famous study to randomize patients to different of the commonly used high blood pressure medicines was called the all-hat study, where patients were randomized to 4 different groups of first-line blood pressure medicines, the ones that are all approved that we all use. To do that study, it took millions and millions and millions of dollars and many years. Because every patient had to be approved, had to give consent to being randomized to get one of these medicines that, to be honest, they were going to get anyway. And it was going to be a largely randomized process. I start my patients who need it on lisinopril, certain kinds of patients. The person next to me in my clinic, he always uses losartan. That's a slightly different drug. Same mechanism of action, but a different target. I like lisinopril. I think it's better in certain ways. He likes losartan. We don't know which is better. And to repeat all hat is just, the NIH is not going to pay for it again. And part of the barrier is the price of sending around nice people like Kayla and Sam sitting there in our conference room picture to consent these patients and have them say, yes, it's okay to randomize which medicine I'm getting. And so the idea is to actually serve patients better by learning in cases where the choices are very safe. They're both approved, say, in the case of these blood pressure medicines. And slowing down the learning is, and perhaps putting people on medicines that are too expensive, because we haven't compared them to the cheaper ones head to head, is actually violating the trust people have in us. The argument would be that, yes, we actually are acting on the need to take care of our patients best by making sure we learn and by doing these kind of studies where we could randomize people, where we really can't do it if we ask each individual patient. But Nick, what you raised is exactly the other side of the coin. You're saying, yeah, Pete, good. In all your effort to be better at being a steward of care and a steward of the healthcare resources and a provider of healthcare, you want to find this stuff out. Well, good for you, Peter. But now you've actually messed it all up, because now patients will be like, whoa, when I go to IU Health, sometimes I'm involved in research without knowing about it. Sounds like one of the horrors of medicine. Like I was just teaching this morning about Tuskegee, right? I'm being involved in a research study without being told. Like, how is that going to actually help us? Is actually going to be a case of respecting trust and acting on trust. And so, Nick, your question is exactly on target. On the one hand, we're trying to actually be trustworthy by learning as much as we can in our care without in any way harming or putting patients at risk. And on the other hand, this method of maybe moving forward and having a different form where patients aren't hearing so much about research going on could actually undermine that trust. Now, maybe what you like, Nick, you can come back on if you want, or you can pass, but the type 2, maybe you feel that the type 1 ones should all be type 2 ones, right? Where at the very least they should be told. There's a study going on which may affect which blood pressure medicine you get, or which way you're being texted, or how many times your blood is being drawn. There's a study going on which you're part of. If you really don't want to be part of the study, you're out. You are in control to make that gesture. So you might say type 1 examples. That's one where we think the risks are so low, we don't even have to tell the patients. Maybe, Nick, your concern is don't do that. At the very least, do this, the type 2 ones, the opt-out ones, or to more traditional consent. Does that help address your question, Nick? Or
yes, it does. I'm just a big believer in transparency. The type 2 option seems much more transparent.
Can't go wrong with transparency. We say often in terms of it's showing our expressing our conflict of interest. In a paper. Much better to list all your possible conflicts than to think, oh, this one's not important, so I won't list it. Cool. Is there another comment? I hear somebody murmuring. It's Kayla. No.
reactions at the bottom. So
Oh, is there a reaction? I can't see. Oh, here it is. Reactions.
our mic's not on. Our mic's on.
Oh, I got chat. Here we go. Oh, we got chat. Meg, what are you doing, Meg? You don't chat. You're not a kid, Meg. Who do you think you are? Think you're getting younger? Okay, so Meg says, do you want to say it yourself?
Okay, well, I just think it's funny because I think CVS might be participating in the number one situation. For years, they always called to let us know that a prescription was ready. Last week, for the first time, I got an email, no phone call, an email. I thought, well, this is kind of intriguing. I guess I should have asked them what the deal was.
Well,
I think I appreciated Nick's comment. I do think that this second the second scenario seems really pretty different in quality and context than the first one. I think you can make a pretty good argument, although the comment about transparency is appropriate. If you're ever going to have a type 1, I think your first one, the randomized study about the text or email, that probably could fit. But otherwise, I'm not sure about that second example.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's wonderful, Meg. First of all, thank you for the chat and then for coming on camera. You kids today, you don't talk, you only text. So
Yeah,
you're
and
officially a
I
kid.
don't know how to raise my hand, so.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Karen did it. Karen did it. Well, I'll go back to Karen in a second. But let me say something that's Meg, is that I love what you're saying, is that, you know what I suspect? The CVS just changed, right? They didn't do the study. They didn't compare emailing to phone calling to see if it's as good. They just figured it was cheaper and they liked the idea and they just did it. I don't know anything, but in some ways you would say that actually, again, what we want in medicine is more research and less guessing, right? That they just sort of figured they would just move to email. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if they had tried out something and they felt comfortable to actually do a randomized trial? Maybe they did do one first. Maybe you are part of it. And transparency would be good. I like what Nick said and what you're saying, but on the other hand, boy, it's one more hurdle. And if the hurdle stops us from doing the research at all, then you are basically, without there being a study, you're experiencing the risks of the study, right, without us ever knowing if it's for the benefit. And so that's the beauty of learning healthcare system. It's basically like when you get randomized by which blood pressure, you basically are now coming to my clinic, you're basically randomized which thiazide diuretic you're getting. Because if you happen to be on Peter Schwartz's schedule, you get hydrochlorothiazide. If you happen to be on another provider's schedule, you get chlorthalidone. It's just the two that we use. I like the first, others like the second. So you're basically getting randomized. Wouldn't it be better if we at least randomize them in a setting where we could learn, right? Not just with retrospective chart review, the way which we probably do to see if one of the other group has, more side effects or something, or better blood pressure control, but actually randomizing people up front, which is the best way to scientifically do it. So I love your comment, Meg. And now Karen's got her hand up, or somebody in the room. It could be any of you three.
So Peter, I guess my question goes to what do you mean by randomized? I always thought that randomized is random and it's prospectively assigned, but your examples are not describing that.
Oh no, these are both supposed to be randomized trials. This is not the actuality, right? We've not done that first trial. It's a hypothetical one. But the idea is that you would, at Eskenazi, say, in this upcoming year, you would just randomize every patient who's agreed to get text, get notified both ways. You'd randomize them to get it one way or the other. Then you would study it after a year. It'd be a true randomization process, a research process. The second one, the idea is the patient's coming in, let's say you were only going to do patients admitted with COPD. Like only people with COPD, they're not in the ICU, they don't have, maybe they have exclusion criteria. You have some basic group of people with COPD flare. Patients come in with COPD flare, it's basically a breathing problem. Those patients, you might say we check labs up front, and that's probably enough. But because it's the hospital and we have teams of phlebotomists, we draw blood every day. I mean, where I went to residency, that was the way we did it. It was very easy. We got a blood count every day. Every day we got a blood count. And sometimes attendings would kind of say, look, Peter, why are you letting them draw his blood every day? Change it to every other day. You know, like he's in here for COPD. We're waiting for his lungs to get better. We don't need to be checking his blood counts every day. I'd be like, yeah, what if he crashes one night? I'd like to have blood tests on the books, you know, from that day, so I quickly see if he's anemic. But you all have friends. I have patients and friends and family who come out and they show me their arm. Like, look at my arm. My arm is covered with bruises. And so we're all like doing this medicine where we're drawing their blood every day. Partly it's kind of like it's easier for me because I don't draw the blood. I'd rather have the numbers just in case something goes crazy than I'm expecting. But that's a horrible reason to do something. We shouldn't be drawing blood every day unless we have evidence that doing it every day is better than every other day. And eventually that every other day is better than once a week. Maybe once a week is enough. I mean, when I'm at home, nobody's checking my blood every day. If some of my patients tell me that, like, look, I was just in the hospital. You don't check my blood every day. I go a year without getting my blood checked. Why were they sticking me every morning, waking me up from my sleep, bruising my arm, giving me pain? And so, right, the idea of the study, Karen, is that you would do a study. It would have to be carefully planned to be a type 1 for certainly, even a type 2, or you want to be people who are not actually, you know, in DKA, you have to draw blood twice a day because, sorry, Karen's a nurse, everybody. So Kishi and I are talking a little bit in clinician code, but, you know, somebody with diabetic crisis, like, sure, you're going to draw blood a lot, and you don't need a randomized trial to know that that's important. But let's say other kinds of conditions where we don't know you need to be checking blood every day. A person with a stroke, you know, they're in the hospital for a week. Do you need blood counts every day? Probably not. Is it twice a week or once a week? Let's do the study. Let's randomize the patients to get it twice a week or once a week and see if there's any difference in outcomes. And if we don't have a difference in outcomes, we can achieve multiple goals. We're going to save money because we're not running a blood test every day. That's manpower and the lab. 2, we're reducing burden and pain because people aren't getting their blood tests, you know, done every day. And 3, maybe it's even better care or as good care. And so it's worth doing. So that's the idea of this second one. But I'll tell you what, if you need informed consent from each patient to be enrolled in a study where they're going to get blood tests more or less, you know, you're never going to do that study. We're never going to do that study. And so the idea is in the goal of learning, we're pushing for a new model where you could justify doing research, which does not involve an extensive informed consent the way we do now. Again, that's why I was a little bit reluctant to do this as a treats talk, because I feel like it's not here yet. It's more about what's going to happen next. But to be honest, if you're a young researcher getting involved, learning healthcare systems are discussed continually. And this is the kind of framework, if not these specific proposals, that are being moved forward, you know, every day. I would say that at IU, most of the focus on learning healthcare systems comes out of great doctors like Titus Schleier, Bill Bennett over at Regan Strieff, who are trying to, and Aaron Carroll has been the PI of a large grant to train people learning healthcare systems. I would say most of the focus is on better ways to get the data out of the record and back into care, trying to find things out from the observational data, the massive amounts of observational data that we are now acquiring, how to get that part of the learning healthcare system started. So if I wanted to quickly show you, to go down back to the very beginning. This part here, the idea that, you know, we have to begin the analysis and get it back into care as fast as possible. This is a part of learning healthcare system, which does not involve questions of informed consent. And I would say research ethics wise, there are other questions here, ones I really haven't given much focus on in this talk, I'm sorry. But right, the questions here I would say are about science, right? How ready are we to implement things this quickly? Going from research to analysis to implementation. When is that appropriate? That's really a question for a scientist more than for me about when this is safe. Although once you understood the risks and benefits of quickly applying, you know, inferences you have made based on electronic health record, quickly applying them and then doing more research, you know, is that first of all acceptable to patients? Getting back to Nick's question, would this undermine trust? That, boy, my doctor just figured that out today, and now he's trying it on me. What am I, a lab rat? Right. So once again, there's ethics here. But I guess I would say probably this is more the focus of current work being done, certainly around Regan Strieff, is not to change the informed consent structure, but to change the speed and the mechanism by which we take findings and then put them into care. Okay, I've used up my hour in my usual long-winded way. I'm thinking I should have gone back in this talk and done more about this at the beginning, because people who just watch the beginning won't see this. But I do like this came up, Karen, because again, this is I'd say, as important a part of learning healthcare systems as the other stuff which I was talking about. And I'd say this part is the part that's happening now. I'd say a bit more than anything having to do with changing the nature of consent. The only thing about changing nature of consent, which we have seen, and Karen and I in our research work have seen this, has been that there are now more exemptions with the modification of the common rule. It's, I would say, more situations in which you can request an exemption to review by the IRB and to get a waiver on consent. Because again, part of this push to get research done faster, certainly safely, but faster and more efficient. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you all for being here. I'll stop sharing if I know how to do